Welcome to the Gay Buddhist Forum, where teachers from all schools of Buddhism offer their perspectives on the Dharma and its application in modern times, especially for LGBTQI audiences. These talks are offered freely to the world and made possible by appreciative listeners. If you would like to support our efforts to share the Dharma with underserved audiences, please visit gaybuddhist.org. There you can donate, find a list of upcoming speakers, or enjoy many hundreds of these recorded talks dating back to 1996.
Thank you all. It's good to be back. It's been a while. I'm actually in town. I'm in the East Bay. I just got in late last night, but so not unable to come in person, but happy to be here with you all. So I'm going to offer some. Is the sound okay? Are you able to hear me all right? Okay, good. I will offer some reflections on what I call the fragility of life, compassion, holding ourselves and others in the heart, and we'll do so through a bit of the suttas and through stories, which is typically how I teach. So really holding with curiosity what moves and inspires you, what resonates, and letting everything else go. And I'll start with something from the Dhammapada. They go to many a refuge, to mountains, to forests, to parks, trees, and shrines, people threatened with danger. That's not the secure refuge. That's not the highest refuge. That's not the refuge having gone to which you gain release from all suffering and stress. Having gone for refuge to the Buddha, Dhamma, and Sangha, you see with wise discernment the Four Noble Truths: stress, the cause of stress, the transcending of stress, and the Noble Eightfold Path, the way to the stilling of stress. That's the secure refuge. That's the highest refuge. That's the refuge having gone to which you gain release from all suffering and stress, from the Dhammapada. So a few years into my practice, I was practicing with the Thich Nhat Hanh community, with Thich Nhat Hanh's Plum Village Sangha, which is where I started. I was given a Dharma name. And I was given the Dharma name, Peaceful or Joyful Gardener of the Heart. And at that time, I hadn't particularly much thought of myself as being peaceful or joyful, and in fact, quite the opposite. And I think subconsciously hoping to be named something ridiculous, like Braveheart or Thunder Mountain or Lion Tamer, something like that. But I thank the brothers and sisters, the monks and the nuns, for this new name, but said that given at that time my sometimes defended or snarky, sarcastic, aversive personality, that I didn't know if I was so deserving of the name peaceful or joyful. And one of the nuns who knew me well enough agreed, nodding, saying, "Oh, I know. We know you're not very joyful or peaceful, but it's what you are to aspire to. Keep planting the seeds, water them, bring them to the light, and watch them grow. And you will grow into your name, meeting all of the vulnerable and fragile parts of life, and be able to quiet the mind and tend to the heart and respond accordingly." So I'm here all these years later, here this morning, still with the clear intention to tend to the heart, to garden, to meet the fragility and vulnerability of life. And really, I thought of it recently as much like when I met the eyes of both of my daughters. So during their first really difficult first few weeks of life, and experientially at that time, deeply knowing compassion, knowing that this life is quite tender and quite beautiful, and vowing to protect them, and knowing at the same time that I can't protect them from anything, or oftentimes anything at all. That they will know hurt and pain and suffering. We will know hurt and pain and suffering. Such is this life. The fragility and vulnerability between us, as I held these tiny little beings and with just a forearm and hand against my body, really set the heart trembling and quivering. I was afraid. Pounding really as it moved throughout my body. And there was something in that reminded me of how the Buddha described compassion as the trembling of the heart in response to suffering. the heart's connection to all beings and the deep understanding of dukkha, of the unsatisfactoriness of suffering. Compassion being one of the two wings which support us in this flight to freedom. Wisdom being the other wing, the wing that's really holding the deep understanding of the not self nature of things. So in this practice, we practice to create a refuge of belonging. And I believe that metta and karuna, this loving kindness and compassion, are threads that connect our practice, the Dhamma, and social transformation. From the teachings as well, monks, the establishment of mindfulness is to be practiced with the thought, I'll watch after myself. The establishment of mindfulness is to be practiced with the thought, I'll watch after others. When watching after yourself, you watch after others. When watching after others, you watch after yourself. And how do you watch after others when watching after yourself? Through cultivating the practice, through developing it, through pursuing it. This is how you watch after others when watching after yourself. And how do you watch after yourself when watching after others? It's through endurance, through harmlessness, through a mind of goodwill, and through compassion. This is how you watch after yourself when watching after others. It's a bit from the Acrobat Sutta from the Samyutta Nikaya. So compassion supports us in connecting with others through the small sense, while at the same time fostering some emotional intelligence and well-being, right? Harboring a desire for all beings to be free from suffering. Awareness imbued with compassion is what folds into great wisdom. And it's always needed and clearly needed at this time. So I want to share a story with you. And it's a story from a book called The Heart's Code. And it's a book by a psychoneuroimmunologist. I have no idea what a psychoneuroimmunologist is, but it's a wonderful book. And the author is a Dr. Paul Pearsall. And the premise of the book is that the heart has the capacity to both know and remember in a way that's distinct from and as powerful as the brain. And the mind, so the story illustrates how the hearts of some heart transplant recipients seem to hold some of the memories that were from the person whose heart they received. Now, don't get me wrong. I know this probably transcends some of what science knows, and yet I believe that there's a beauty and power in this story that's worthy of our consideration and worthy of practice. So David and Glinda have an argument while driving, and it didn't get resolved, and they sat silently in this resentful energy, and later they got into a car accident, and David died. His heart was donated, and Glinda wanted to meet the recipient of David's heart. So a meeting was arranged between Glinda and a very young man whose life had been saved by the gift of her husband's heart. And now, just before the meeting, Glinda, herself a doctor, said that she felt the presence of her husband tugging at her heart. And at that very moment, the door to the hospital chapel where they were meeting opened, and in walked this young man and his mother. Glinda said, "Can I put my hand on your chest and hold his heart? I mean, your heart." And the young man nodded yes, and he unbuttoned his shirt, and he took her hand and gently placed it against his chest. She trembled and tears rolled down her cheek. She closed her eyes and whispered, "I love you, David. Everything is copacetic." She hugged the young man and they wiped tears from their eyes. They sat down away from the others in the room and held hands in silence. The young man's mother, speaking in a heavy Spanish accent, told the doctors who were there that her son uses this word copacetic all the time. He never used to use it before he got his new heart. "Everything is copacetic" was the very first thing he said to me after the surgery. Glinda overheard and her eyes widened. She turned towards the mother and said, "When David and I made up after an argument, that was our signal that everything was okay." The young man used to be a vegetarian and into heavy metal music. He now craves meat and fatty foods. He now loves R&B and classic soul. Glinda matter-of-factly said her husband loved meat and played in a Motown cover band. A quite literal story of holding others in the heart, right? Cultivating the capacity and openness to hold others need not require a heart transplant. So we can meet the fragility of life with truly consistent practice and continuity of mindfulness. We learn to tune into awareness, and of course, tuning into awareness, we tune into the heart. And once we connect to the heart, we're unable to push ourselves and others out of the heart. We incline the mind again and again towards an openness that invites us to regard others with compassion. We learn to hold ourselves and others in the heart, widening our circle of compassion, extending beyond our immediate circles of friends and family. The purpose of my teaching of the holy life of the Dhamma is not for gaining merit, nor good deeds, nor rapture, nor concentration, but for the sure heart's release. This and this alone is the reason for the teachings, the Buddha from the Dhammapada. The purpose of my teaching of the holy life of the Dhamma is not for gaining merit, nor good deeds, nor rapture, nor concentration, but for the sure heart's release. This and this alone is the reason for the teaching. One of my favorite things from my childhood was to hear my grandfather, who was a deacon at church, give what was called the report of the sick and the shut-in. It was the only reason that I ever wanted to go to church. I would hide not to go to church. But if my grandfather was giving this, then I would volunteer. And he would start off this report that he gave with, our brothers and sisters may be shut in, but are not shut out of our hearts. And the church program that he ran was called the Good Samaritan. And it served those who were sick, those who could no longer come to church because of old age, living in senior homes. Many were in mourning. This was the early 70s. Many had just come back from Vietnam. And many hadn't been to church for years, but were always a part of this report. So my grandfather and a team of others attended to these folks, bringing food, cleaning houses, maintaining yards and property, singing to them and talking with them on their front porches. They always remained a part of the community. In this particular service, their names and photos were pasted on these little cards that were passed around the congregation, and people would offer these words of encouragement and compassion and love. And every hand in the church would physically be connected to a photo and each other until we were all connected in this symbolic harnessing of kindness, generosity, love, and compassion. It was a curious thing for me. My grandfather always said that his role with the ministry was to know them in mind and embrace them by heart. And years after my grandfather died, I received his church notes that had my 8-year-old handwriting in them. So he would go to church with this little leather-bound journal and giving myself and my brother something to do because we didn't particularly want to be there. But we would draw pictures and things. But he also used it to have us write questions to him, or he would write questions to us and we would answer them. So in this particular page of this journal that was given to me, I had asked him a question. The question is cut off. You can't actually see, and it's pretty faded out. So I've never been able to make out the question, but the answer was this: one day I'll die, and I'll die having known a good life of service. And yet I could have loved more. I could have especially loved others more. This love expresses itself as a concern for my neighbors, my friends, and everyone I come in touch with in person, over the phone, and in my letters to the prisoners. I let that love permeate me, overcome me, overwhelm me, and then direct me. Which, when I read that, was akin to what I know from the Metta Sutta and what I know from the Buddhist teachings on loving kindness. And my father was definitely, he was a Black man from the South. He was not a Buddhist. One day I'll die, and I'll die having known a good life of service. And yet I could have loved more. I could have especially loved others more. This love could have expressed itself as a concern for my neighbors, my friends, and everyone I come in touch with over the phone and in my letters to the prisoners. He did prison ministry. I let that love permeate me, overcome me, overwhelm me, and then direct me. Holding others in our hearts. Some years ago here in Berkeley, I had an opportunity to lead a school program. I worked with youth for 26 years. I was leading a particular school program for 5 to 8-year-olds. And after a couple of weeks of informal lessons on empathy, compassion, and gratitude, which was all an effort on my part to mitigate some of the fighting and hurt feelings that were becoming quite intense and really taking over my day. So I had the kids write and talk about the experience of empathy and compassion in relation to each other. And I had asked them to let me know if the feeling of compassion ever seemed, or empathy ever seemed like it came to mind during the day, or when they noticed it. And every now and then I would have a few kids who would remember, and they would run up to me and tell me how they felt when someone didn't have cookies in their lunch, or fell from the play structure, or lost in a game, or whose parent came to pick them up late. And my favorite, there was a particular little boy who ran up to tell how he felt for another little boy because this little boy had 4 moms, and how that was a lot of people to be bossing you around. And he said that one of the moms was a woman named Jenna, who's a dear friend of mine. So he said, yeah, and one of the moms her name is Jenna, and all the others are the exes. And I said, I don't think they're all called the exes. I think they actually have names, but he was insistent that it was Jenna and the exes. So what prevents us from feeling compassion or meeting the fragility of life, meeting suffering? The stress of societal competition, consuming old tropes, examined stories, legacies of oppression, internalized homophobia, productivity and the obsession with multitasking, et cetera, et cetera. All of these things exacerbate the regression to fight, flight, or freeze, right? All cultivating into a race to the bottom. And this creation of us versus them, this creation of the others, this creation of the unreal others, the separation from ourselves. So I'd mentioned my grandfather's church program, the Good Samaritan, which reminded me that there's this really interesting study that had been done, I believe, at one of the Ivy Leagues, it's Princeton or Brown. And the study was called the Good Samaritan study. So these seminary students were given a practice sermon, and half of them were assigned to the story of the Good Samaritan, the other half, some other random Bible study story. And the students were supposed to go to another building to give a sermon and be evaluated on it. But on their way to the other building, they passed a fellow student in a doorway who was moaning in distress. So the real question of the study was whether the seminary students were going to stop for help. And the research showed that it depended on how much time they thought they had before they had to give their sermon. If the students believed that they would be late, they didn't stop to help the fellow student. Even if the sermon that they were about to preach was about being a good Samaritan. I found this to be actually quite revealing and powerful. So that we might feel the tender reverberations, the quivering of the heart that moves us to compassionate action or tender care and concern at the very least, there needs to be a stop. There needs to be a pause, a looking at, a reflecting on. See, the more contracted, threatened, and stressed that we feel, the more likely we're to view others as well as ourselves as them, the others, the unreal others, meaning that when we see them, they're perhaps an object that may have something that we want: approval, money, affection, something. And if none of those, we're likely to have little or no interest in them at all. So how do we shift from habitually seeing the unreal other to realizing our interconnected nature, our interconnection, the fragility of life, the widening circles of compassion rather than the shrinking circles? And it's not just feeling a sense of care, it's acting on it. It's compassionate action and fierce compassion that will widen the circles of compassion. Letting ourselves be touched, brought about by mindful awareness, deep listening, and actively responding with care. And the active response is a crucial part of it. It's a part of what wakes up compassion. And our conditioning is often to shrink or contract from suffering. We often don't allow ourselves to meet the vulnerability that's in the field. So cultivating fierce compassion means having the courage, the commitment, the concern, as well as the intention to lean into suffering and be touched, allowing the heart to move into action. Now, our unreal others are strangers, those that we keep strange. It's also those that are close to us, who as soon as we're feeling resentment or really having a strong agenda, they become unreal. But it's really the ones that are more distant that become most unreal, and we typecast and stereotype quickly. So if another's unreal, it's easy and okay to hurt them. It's those of another gender, of a race, of another orientation, color, geographic location, age, political affiliation. It's the undocumented, the newly immigrated, it's those that are Jewish, it's those that are queer, Black, seniors, women deciding what to do with their bodies, right? Many, many, many in this country and in countries across the globe are routinely lumped into groups of unreal others. One last story. So on a bus ride from a small rural area into a big city, years ago, a young person was clearly in distress. Exaggerated mannerisms, tears, shaking. And the situation was made worse by the clerk at the bus station, who had this look of pure disgust and was quite short and rude. And the running commentary from the workers in the background was, what does it want? Where is it going? And all of the co-signing smirks and smiles and laughter from other people in line, the co-signing, the hatred, sort of this bonding and creating an other. And the young person was so distraught that they were dropping their change, the money that they needed for this ticket. And a man pushed forward after hearing all this take place and bought a ticket for them. During the boarding, the young person who was the target of this inhumanity, this hatred, walked by and yelled, "I'm an effing human. I'm a person. I'm trans. Thanks for all your help while I was being bullied." And they walked on towards the back of the bus. Just a minute later, they walked back up towards the aisle after the bus was moving and said, "And thank you," to the man who had helped them. And the man said, "Hey, there's room enough for all of us on this planet. I'm happy to help. It's the right thing to do. My name's Don. What's your name?" And the young person said, "My name's Taylor. Nice to share the planet with you." "Yes," said Don. "I put myself in your shoes, and here we are. People are so afraid, man. They're just so afraid. Bunch of cowards." Taylor said, "I'd happily put myself in your shoes, but a girl's got fashion standards to uphold." And they both smiled and winked and cracked up, and everybody went about their day. And you might have figured out that As narrator, I was on that bus, and I sat quietly, really in a deep guilt and shame and disappointment that I failed to be any bit of a light, a resource, a helper. And granted, there was some trauma for me that kicked up, that kept me frozen. And I vowed to resource myself so that I could be available for myself and others to do and be better. I wasn't surprised, yet I was shocked by the display of hatred and moved by the display of support. I didn't forget about what I had done or not done, and I didn't wallow in it either. I vowed to do better and be better and become better educated. And I did become better educated with what some folks have to go through. Compassion begins with mindfulness, letting ourselves recognize and be touched by discomfort, pain, and suffering, by our own and others, sensing how deeply our lives actually intertwine and responding with a heartfelt response. It's touching the hearts and allowing our hearts to be touched. It's deep listening. It's breathing in and breathing out. It's breathing in the realness, the rawness of what's here. And we breathe out. We offer our care and our tenderness. That's how we meet the marginalized. That's how we meet the vulnerable. That's how we meet ourselves. That is how we meet the fragility of life. Taking a moment to look behind the mask to see vulnerability and humanity that's there in ourselves and others, and perhaps feel with the breath and the heart what's going on, noticing tenderness and care. It speaks to fierce compassion. Fierce compassion is a practice that can wake up and free your heart. And of course, at times we may feel overrun and overwhelmed by our own suffering and that of others, feeling thin skinned. And we may feel that the vulnerability is too much. I felt that recently. It's wise to be discerning and to be appropriate in order to ground and resource, perhaps turning our attention to something more neutral in order to breathe and to ground and to find space. And sometimes we underestimate our capacity and our resources. If you perceive yourself as simply a self carrying all the world's suffering, then of course there's not going to be the space needed to hold it all. But imagining ourselves in another's shoes as a part of a flow, as a part of the universe that is breathing in and out, expanding and contraction, we can be in the flow and in a great spaciousness. We can be the sky holding all of the weather patterns and not just the dark clouds. From this place, we can experience a heart ready for anything. In the stillness of the quiet, if we listen, we can hear the whisper of the heart, giving strength to weakness, courage to fear, hope to despair. Howard Thurman. Give me everything mangled and bruised, and I will make a light of it to make you weep, and we will have rain and begin again. Dina Metzger. So I hope there was something in there to inspire you, that moved you, that was of some support, of some benefit. Take that in and leave the rest. Thank you all for your practice.
Devin, would you be open to questions and comments?
Yes, absolutely. Only softball questions and only good, positive comments. No, I'm open to whatever. Yes, absolutely.
The floor is open. We usually have a pretty loquacious group here. Marcus.
Hey, and Marcus. Thanks, Devin. Yeah, that was a really awesome speech. I really did get a lot from it. I like the part when you said that the monks gave you your new name. How do you feel about your name now? Do you feel like you've really grown into it, or like what was that process of journey like?
Yeah, you know, I mean, there's that the old part of me that still just wants like lion tamer, Braveheart, wants to control wants to just control the process. I want to be able to name myself what I want to name myself, and I've learned over the years that name is exactly what I needed. It was something. It's a reminder, something to grow into, and I keep it in mind, right? That this is all a process that my Dharma practice has been a long journey. And I'm no longer, right, I would always say that, oh, I'm an aversive type. I have this, you know, I lived into this particular identity. And yeah, there were parts of that here and there. There are parts of that now, but it's not a solid identity. It's just, yeah, it's a little bit of who, what was going on for me at the time, right? Those causes and conditions came together that created this particular identity that I really held on to. I've moved on to greed. Aversion's not a problem now. It's just greedy. I'm just greedy now.
Thank you.
Yes, Bob.
Yes, thank you so much. You stimulated lots of thoughts in me. One in particular, I realized when I feel compassion, I'm not conscious of it in the moment. I'm not really aware of it until reflecting on the time experienced later. Happiness, however, I generally know right in the moment. Are those common thoughts and feelings? I don't know. Just wondering.
Yeah. Thank you, Bob. Absolutely. I mean, I've had that experience as well. I mean, if there's happiness or joy there, then it's immediately I'm connected to that instantly. Compassion can be the same, but it can be a little. It can be a bit different. I can run up against that suffering or pain of myself or another, and there's a feeling there. But my own conditioning has been to, right, there's like some anger or difficulty or other emotions are there covering up and I don't quite get to it. Or there might be a bit of a sense of compassion there, but I need a little bit of time, really, I think, to process it and integrate it. And maybe I'm at home or the next day, and there may be like almost a welling up of tears or a deep feeling of sadness, care, and concern. And that's, you know, compassion there, you know, many hours, days after whatever it was that I experienced, you know. So I've had both of those things happen for me. Absolutely. Yeah. And I do, right? I mean, I try to be in touch with emotions and feelings there in the moment, but I think at like meeting difficulty, right? At times that can be hard. So, you know, there you may meet a difficult experience, and, you know, it's not often that the go-to instantly in that moment is the quiver and reverberation of the heart, compassion, and really feeling and knowing that. And that's absolutely fine, right? It will come as long as we try to stay close to our hearts. Then it will come. We'll find it. It'll find us. Thank you so much for your question. I think I see Richard.
Hi, Devin. Thank you very much for your talk. I wanted to reflect or ask, perhaps you could help guide me. I have two careers. One is in gardening, working with cultivating nature, and the other is.
Richard, your sound is very low.
Okay, is this better?
Yes.
So one of my careers is in gardening. The other is in catering work, where I am serving people, sometimes very high-end, wealthy homes, sometimes in a private club in the Tenderloin, where I walk past people in the street, living in the streets. And I've learned from my spiritual teacher to have compassion for people in all walks of life. and recognize that we're all human. But I really struggle with having compassion for myself. I really find it very difficult to be accepting and loving and compassionate towards myself. I can be compassionate towards the living beings, the plants that I plant and nurture and help to grow and thrive, but not myself. And perhaps you could comment on that.
Yeah, thank you very much. Yeah, I mean, that's one that absolutely comes up. So I'll say two of the hardest practices for in general that we typically say, they always say the West, but I think on the continent, metta and karuna, loving kindness and compassion are two of the hardest practices. And I think two of the most important practices to do for just the reason that you're saying, right? That those are the practices that will allow us to become closer to ourselves, to be able to have a bit of that feeling, or to begin to have the experience of compassion for self. And it takes a while. It's not one that's going to be easy, and it's not one that's going to happen right away. And I usually think so in working with people for self-compassion. There are actually some wonderful self-compassion programs. It's the biggest problem with it is most people don't stick with it, right? Their conditioning is so dug in that it takes, they're doing it for a little bit, but all of that attention and focus on self is incredibly difficult. And there's actually a woman, she's a secular teacher, but I have found has had some wonderful practices, simple daily practices to try to sort of light that pilot light of self-compassion. It's a woman named Kristen Neff, N-E-F-F, and she runs a self-compassion program. And as I said, it's secular, and I actually think it's worth looking into, because I know a number of people that have been really helped and supported by that. But and beyond that, within a formal practice of being able to offer a bit of self-compassion or metta at the beginning of a sitting or at the end of a sitting really on a daily basis. And that, right? It doesn't need to be a full-on practice that you're doing every day, all day, for hours, anything like that, but just to plant that seed on a day-to-day basis, because it takes a lot to build this a groove as deep that's filled with compassion and self-compassion and loving kindness as our normal, natural negativity bias that we have, right? That we've had for however long we've been living, 40, 50, 60, 70 years. We have that, and we're trying to counter it. So in order to create the new groove, it has to be done. You have to chip away at it. Okay, Richard.
Well, let's take one last question from John E.
Hi, thank you so much, Devin. It was so wonderful, moving to hear you. I find in terms of self-compassion, those places where I've been othered are the most difficult ones. It's not so much on the personal or interpersonal level, but on the collective level. Like when I begin to feel othered and I belong to a group of people who are being othered and attacked, I find it, my defense is just to turn away. And I don't feel like I'm really engaging and working with that part of myself that's been othered. So.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And that, right, thank you, John, very much. And the experience of being othered is a difficult one. Oftentimes, so there, we will dive into whatever group that we are part of that has been othered. We will dive into that and engage to stop whatever is happening. Makes sense on one hand. And on another hand, it's actually more important, personally for me, it's been more important to turn within, to really be able to soothe and heal and understand the hurt and pain that's happened here. And I still engage on the outside with whatever group I'm in, but to really take care of what's going on in here. You know, it was much like when when I spoke of being on the bus and the person that was you know, being bullied there. It was really interesting, right? Because I was frozen for a while because I recall being in a situation where, you know, just the other folks around were immediately challenging. You know, I wasn't one of them. I wasn't man enough. I wasn't like the other boys. There was something wrong with me, and there was hints of that, and scared the hell out of me. And I was frozen. I remember it from a long time. And I realized, oh yeah, those are those parts that, though I have worked with them and taken a look at them, they're still there, and they're still quite tender at times. So it's one of those things that we do, that we take good care of what's going on here, right? I don't ignore whatever group I'm in, whatever group that I belong to that has been collectively traumatized or collectively othered, but we want to make sure to not have the work all be outward facing, but to have, you know, much of the work being done right here. Thank you so much, John.